to start with, I wanted you to mull about, consider and ponder, what are you looking at? I'm sure that in your previous studies, you've encountered many of the aspects of what you're going to see here in computational modeling and dynamical systems. Definitely in courses like computational science, if you had it with me, but also in the broad spectrum of nanobiology. So nanobiology is not necessarily about things being microscopic or nanoscopic, but more about using mathematics to explain biology, mathematics and physics to understand and explain biology. And never was it more true than here in this course and in the masters. So what do you think you're looking at? We see the feeding currents of the Patidia miniata, the starfish larvae. And this looks beautifully, I think you notice, like a vector field, right? And so this little embryo, as it's growing, the larva as it's growing, it is inducing some specific currents to make sure that its surface is properly tended by nutrients in copious amount. But more interestingly, these trajectories that the individual nutrient particles are taking, they are continuous and uninterrupted. This is going to relate later to a theorem that we're going to be discussing later in week 5 in the course, the continuity theorem. And what I wanted to just impress upon you here is that despite the fact that this larvae doesn't know anything about maths, it's inducing something a pattern very specific to optimize a certain problem. Now, okay, I've introduced you to the starfish larvae, and I'm going to quickly introduce myself to you once again. So I'm Mario Negrello, and what I do for a living is computational neuroscience at the Erasmus Medical Center. And I've studied in a vast variety of these fields. So I had my PhD in the topics of evolutionary robotics. You like Evo-Devo, and so do I. I've used Evo-Devo principles to develop recurrent neural networks that controlled robots. Also studied reinforcement learning at the time. And particularly, I've applied the notions that you learn in this course to study the dynamical systems that the recurrent neural networks in these robots embedded. So here you see the dynamics of recurrent neural networks. And one core concept of what you're going to be seeing in this lecture is the idea of parameter space analysis, to try to understand the qualitative changes that happen in the behavior of a system as you smoothly change parameters. So these words are going to become second nature to you by the end of this. And if you look just on the one below, you've noticed that these concepts are now used in high level and sophisticated models of the cerebellar system that we are developing also in the computational neuroscience department. Dynamics of the cerebellum. First of all, this is a colleague of yours who is now my PhD student called Leonard Lensmeyer. He's put together this animation of our most recent model of the inferior olive of the cerebellum of the mouse. And the principles underlying it, so biophysical principles, give rise to high-level dynamical phenomena that we're going to be discussing here. So even though this is a piece of brain with hundreds of thousands of neurons, and these neurons have compartments, you can use the tools that we're going to be learning about here to analyze its behavior, particularly in the context of coupled oscillators. So we're going to be talking about phenomena such as synchrony and so forth and so on. The lecture that I had planned for today had 2 components. The first one is an introduction to the topics of dynamical systems, just a taxonomy of the grand scheme of things, let's say, so that I give you a mindset of how you're going to go into it. At the end of it, we're going to be talking about the specifics of the course, like how much effort you're supposed to devote to it and its structure. You probably now know that we're going to be dealing with Jupyter notebooks and projects that you're going to be working on your own. And so I'm going to describe that towards the end of the lecture. Okay. If you want to know more about dynamics of brains and how they tie in with the study of dynamical systems, these are two books on the topic. I think that might be useful, particularly the computational modeling of the brain. So we bundle together a great set of contributions on the topic of modeling the brain across many scales. One surprising thing that turns out is that across all the scales, it feels as if dynamical systems is just a way to look at it. I hope that you will agree with me that this is going to be a useful tool for your toolbox if you're pursuing this particular thread. And let us move forward with what the course is like. So computational modeling and dynamical systems is about coding simulators. So you've been gorging your eyes in the visual beauty of simulators in general. And nanobiology has introduced you to a large set of models so far. And many of these have very enticing visualizations. So this is another moment in which you can exercise your own creativity with respect to the visualization of biological phenomena. To study complex dynamics. Now, the reasons why we model, which I would inquire you, and I feel like intuitively you, as a nanobiologist, you have it in your hearts already. Clearly, partially is because models help us understand phenomena, either simple and complex. Model help us deal with the complexity. We make complex models and then suddenly simplicity emerges from the complexity. They provide a unified framework for discussion, give us the words with which we can speak. They say, oh, you've assumed this particular physical constant here. At least now we have a language to talk about, right? So if someone criticizes your model, then they have specifics to point at, and then we can talk about it. That's the exact idea. We have a packet. Models can generate novel predictions, things that you didn't know. You cobble up a sufficiently complex system and stuff comes out that wasn't there. Previous models are all wrong, as you probably heard by now, but they must be modified to account for the new data. So it's the interaction between modeling and experiment that really bring the mind together. The mind is also a modeling device. I would like to think of yourself I would like yourselves to think about yourselves as modeling machines. When we're creating a piece of language, embodies a phenomenon that is, in a sense, a model. We're trying to make better models that are more formal, more predictive, more consistent with phenomena, but really the interaction, the necessary changes to make the model better or to make it fit to certain outputs. That's the essence. Now, this is a little bit of a difference between statistical models. And in statistical models, you sometimes have many parameters and you can fit any curve. But that's not the notion here. In dynamical systems, we're trying to find mechanism. And in mechanism, we're trying to represent the causal interactions of reality. So we do computational modeling because we want to improve and reinforce, or maybe even contradict the predictions from verbal theories, because those can be tenuous due to lack of specificity and flexibility of vague verbal constructs. What I mean by this is that, say, in neuroscience, there's a lot of papers published with excellent data and beautiful results, interesting experiments, but wringing a theory in words is easier than making sure that you make a modeling, computational modeling counterpart that actually expresses not only what you see, not only the phenomenon or the parts of the phenomenon that you chose to describe, but its entire spectrum. And so model in general, they allow for the control and selection of the relevant observables and hidden variables. So it's about selection. Like in modeling, often it's about what you put in. And sometimes you have to put in a lot of stuff. If you saw the cerebellar model that I just shown you, this is a model that might strike you as a bit iffy. You saw like so many neurons. I mean, how can you assume every single neuron has so many ion channels and in the single neuron has all these proteins? I mean, isn't this large scale model too unparameterized? Well, the beauty is, and we wouldn't do it if it wouldn't be stepwise fail safes and sanity checks that we made to know which variables we can include and understand and which variables we shouldn't. So the variables and the parameters in the model, they acquire causal roles, and it's through their causal roles that we then interpret them, change them, verify them, explain them, and create these modeling counterparts. Now, I don't think I have to sell a computational modeling for you because this is a compulsory course. I feel like if I give you a few views of how this has helped me look into their value, I would also be sharing with you the value that you're going to gain from studying this. And nowhere but in function and form, the study of morphogenesis and dynamics, are dynamical systems more prevalent. I'm going to give you a few examples of pattern generation models now. And this is the motivation part of the course. So let us discuss complex adaptive and dynamical systems for a little while. So a system, as many of you will know, is a collection of organized things, a whole composed of relationships amongst its members. So it's an organized whole, right? So you have many little elements, and that's a system. Now, the solar system is a system. Actually, it happens to be also a dynamical system, where the future is determined by the rules that are embodied in physics, right? So dynamical systems are extrapolations from these models. The trick is often to discover what are the laws governing the appearance of system form. So what the rules are, the components embody the rules. So dynamical systems are those that have a set of formal rules that determine their future. So you have in the case, for example, of the solar system, you have a set of equations representing the position and velocity of all of the masses, and they give us intense predictability about the positions of the planets. And they also give the notion that predicting is hard because perfect measurement is impossible. Another kind of systems are the complex systems. You must have heard about them before. Also, many biological systems look like complex systems. And you would have encountered the definition potentially in the past. Complex systems are defined as a system of interacting simpler parts. Now, to what extent these simpler parts are simpler. One often shared example about complex systems are ant colonies. Now, an ant is a particularly complex system just by itself. You look at the ant, it's like almost infinite complexity in the ants, like as many organisms. But it turns out that if you symbolize the behavior of ants according to certain basic principles, you can explain a lot of the colony's behaviors without having to assume all the biological complexity. So you have interacting little ants, and they have observable phenomena. I'll tell you the anecdote. So people found out that looking into ant nests, that they had little ant cemeteries. So bodies of ants were actually in specific chambers in the nest. People were wondering, like, how do the ants know how to create a cemetery? It turns out that the rule for cemetery formation in the case of ants is rather simple. What the ant does, and can be explained by, what the ant does is, ant loiters around in the nest and, goes about its usual business. When it finds a dead ant, it picks it up, and then it carries it on and on until it finds another dead ant, and then it drops it. So this you can see in your mind's eye that will create a accumulation of dead ants in a specific place, right? And so typical complex system behavior, a simple set of rules explaining an emergent behavior. And then we have the complex dynamical adaptive systems, such as the brain or the cell, right? Things that absorb the influences of the environment and transform them via their simpler interacting pieces into adaptive behavior, into behavior that is well matched with the environment. So this gradient between dynamical systems, and complex adaptive systems is the reason why we're studying dynamical systems now, because the views afforded by the first steps into this theoretical framework will give you enormous insight about the entire spectrum of life. And particularly provides a vocabulary that describes phenomena across many temporal and spatial scales in similar ways. We can then talk about cosmological phenomena and quantum phenomena, sometimes in similar vocabularies. You've noticed before that some models apply many different scales. Dynamical systems embodies this notion. It explains similarities across this type of phenomenon. It gives powerful intuitions about how complex and adaptive data can emerge from simple rules. I just give you an example now. There are many other examples. It explains the guises of pattern formation. And pattern formation is so important for function. It uses the concepts of symmetry breaking or bifurcations and abrupt transitions. And it tries to explain how order arises from what otherwise would seem like maximally entropic systems, completely homogeneous. And it would also explain emergence of dynamical phenomena such as oscillations, waves, propagations, and so forth and so on. Now, what are these dynamical phenomena that I was referring to? So these are the words that by the end of this course are going to be, it's kind of like me. You speak English, you speak Dutch, you speak your other languages, and now you're going to speak dynamical systems. And this is dynamical systems lingo. Attractors, bistability, bifurcations, hysteresis, limit cycles, periodicity or aperiodicity, and synchronization. Those are the essences, the essential terms that we're going to be using here. This is just a component of a larger spectrum. This is a picture of complex systems in general, and you will see here nonlinear dynamics and systems theory close together with pattern formation, evolution, adaptation, elective behavior, and game theory. So all of these components, many of which are going to be present in this course, beautifully mingle with each other. It's almost impossible to actually create these circles because there are so many possible connections for these complex systems. I'll share these slides with you so that you can take some time to look deeper into some of these terms. And it would be interesting for you to now look at these and see how many of these words you have an intuitive understanding now, how many of these words are new to you, and then do the same thing in 8 weeks from now, in which then you will have completely different view of what the word chaos means, for example, or you'll have a different way to think about homeostasis potentially, and even clearly also pattern formation and so forth. History is important also for science. This is a picture of the timeline of the study of complex systems. So you see how young for a scientific discipline, how young this all is. And obviously computers help, right? So no simulations means like we can't have many of these insights from emergence before we can compute with many pieces. And so systems science, I mean, they do have their small beginning in the likes of Newton and Henri Poincaré. We're going to be talking about Poincaré quite a bit. And cybernetics, a word that might have gotten a different meaning over the years, but is eminently related with artificial intelligence also. Connectionism. So the idea of using artificial neural networks to represent cognitive brain function is related to the ideas in cybernetics. And so it might be interesting if you have the heart of the historian of science to have a look at how these threads combine and talk to each other. Might be a nice way to do some YouTube video searches rather than just getting YouTube to provide to you what are the 10 most recent videos. Look into some of the stuff that underlies the modern knowledge. And so these terms here will give you some interesting hits. Things like swarm behavior and emergence have been introduced in the 80s. So you see, this is all pretty young. And now here, big data, right? So you're here and you're looking into also ethics and policy because you want the world to take into account those ideas. Also applied complexity. Here's us using some applied complexity theory for education. And so where we're going, right? I hope I will see you taking this forward. Here's a sampler of examples transforming complexity from simplicity. So in ants, you have colonies with complex behavior. They emerge, things emerge. Like neurons are simpler than thoughts. One would like to think, in which your neurons can spike or not. And thought is this multidimensional, multifaceted, full of pictures and patterns of this idea, the set of ideas. One person doesn't need to democracy. Many people do need some sort of organizational system that emerges from us, right? And the properties of politics are often also properties of dynamical systems. In fact, there is a model published in Science about how bipolar beliefs emerge in a system that is catalyzed by social media. You can argue with the model, but at least it's there for you to look into. Produce aggregates or the slime molds, produce complex fruiting bodies. Cows, herd, fireflies can produce synchrony. I don't know if you knew, but some fireflies do blink synchronously. We're going to talk about that last week. Now, the characteristics that transform simplicity into complexity are the fundamental insights that we want to cater for with the projects. So the projects are supposed to be giving us the ability for your brain to catch on these. How is it that nonlinearities imply sometimes irreducibility? How is it that complex systems creating, what does it mean to be emergent? What is a phase transition in that context? How do things self-organize? In which ways can they self-organize? What is criticality? And how is it that some history, the history of interactions and the history of experience of the substrate creates a path dependent that makes us individuals in a sense. We're all humans, we're all similar, but we're all different. And what makes us different is experience and genes, and experience like at the broadest sense. So there's enormous path dependency. So we're balancing out complexity and simplicity by understanding, by you making recourse to these terms. To be a bit more concrete, the patterns that are created from the dynamics of systems and complex systems are many, and they have functions. Let me talk a little bit about not the disembodied pattern formation, but the very tangible functions that certain patterns can perform. So if you see a tree, in the back of your mind, you're thinking, well, I mean, so something is taking something from the ground all the way to the leaves. It has something to do with circulation and transport, right? But also, if you see something in a tree shape, it can be a crack, I mean, like a crack in a crystal has a tree shape, or a river has has this kind of branching shape, especially as it is coming close to the delta crevice. Are there similarities between these patterns? They do. What functions do they have? We can talk about waves, or we can talk about propagation through waves, also transport, creation of texture, and potentially different skin absorption properties. You can think about them. You see spirals in the heart, in the propagation of contractions in the heart, especially when it's healthy. You see spirals in the slime mold. You see spirals in chemistry. You see helicoidal patterns in the stomach of sharks. You see helicoids in DNAs and in shells. You see things clumping up like in clusters, as in cell differentiation, segregation. Bubbles have also function. They can become cell membranes. They can become eggs. They enclose certain ideas. So These are the functions of patterns. So this is to give you the idea that even though we might describe abstractly the creation of a pattern, in the back of your minds, when you're dealing with a real problem, you should also be thinking about the embodied function it performs. Let me discuss a few of these examples quickly, okay? So these are trees. Which one is the cell and which one is the galaxy? If I phrase it like this, it's probably easy, right? So which one are neurons? We would like to know whether the generating processes may or may not be similar. Are there some rules that might unify the two or not? Some pattern analogies are superficial and some are more profound. In branches and trees, I mean, in these ones, these pattern similarities are very striking. On the left here, you see a Purkinje cell, Purkinje neuron in the cerebellum. It's a flat neuron, and that flat neuron receives information. Oh, see, like I write my hand and recognize my gesture. It receives input from orthogonally shooting through fibers. Then you see the fan coral that positions itself orthogonally to the flow of nutrients in a water stream. And you have the three-dimensional branching pattern of the lungs that are acquiring oxygen from a fractal amount of alveoli. So trying to maximize the absorption surface of the inner lungs. They grow, right? There are some analogies and metaphors we can extract from the perspective of, say, information collecting or collection in all of these. And there might also be generating mechanisms that inspire us to think about one or the other. We can sometimes even generalize. And now, first time I saw this picture on the internet, it's a moving picture. I mean, the birds keep it off, but these clusters of breathing trees, right? Like, first thing I thought was alveoli, and these are not alveoli, and definitely they're not moving like that in the lungs. But the point here is that the ways in which they clump might share some properties with the ways in which alveoli clump also in the lungs. And talking about sharing properties, a simple model of making a tree could include just a few simple rules, such as you start with the root and you produce a certain growth in a certain direction with a certain probability. And then you terminate a new branch with another probability. So for every single step, you make a decision about what you're going to do next. And so with a certain probability, you might branch. And with a certain probability, you might stop. Now, let me generate one of these neurons for you on the fly, if my computer allows me. Oh, what happened? It's all grayed out. Okay. I'll move on with another example that is not mine. I'll see if I can show this to you later. These types of small beginnings also give us ways to explain very complex patterns that are very geometrical in nature. You might have run across the Romanesco broccoli in your favorite grocery store. And this is a model of the formation of the Romanesco broccoli. And you will be happy to hear that it has to do with the Fibonacci series and also pineapples, surprisingly, and even Christmas trees. Simple rules. This is actually a picture of real biology. This is a real Romanesco broccoli, right? Applying its own rules recursively because of what it is, expresses complex geometrical patterns that are fractal in nature. That's another term that we're going to be hearing a lot about here in the course, like particularly after the fourth session. We're going to be studying some properties of fractals and thinking about what makes a fractal and why is it that the Romanesco broccoli looks that much like a fractal. You'll see that there are differences between reality and the theoretical abstractions that we use. but that the overlap between the reality and the theoretical abstractions is very compelling for a number of scales. You've seen waves as well. So here's another side-by-side example. And in this case, the theory underlying the pattern formation for both is the same. So you would be allowed to guess which one is chemistry and which one is biology. But it clearly, seeing this unfolding in your screen, it gives you the sense that this is too fast to be biology, even though it's actually faster than real time. It's about, I think, 4 times faster than real time. This is the Belousov-Zabotinsky reaction, which produces an oscillatory reaction that transforms the reactants and the reagent into each other in a loop. And if you spread it out in space, they produce then these propagating spirals alternately. On the right, you have the dictyostelium slime mold, and up to a certain point, so the theory that we use to explain this pattern formation is the reaction diffusion. You might have stumbled upon it in your previous studies, and you will see more about waves and synchrony and pattern formation towards the course, and potentially also for your final projects. So this is a dictyostelium. Let's see how long this is, because these are CAMP waves. I mean, they're probably hard to see, but these are cyclic AMP and dictyostelium, like recorded in real time. It was the best video I could find. I'm sure that nowadays there's a nanobiology teacher potentially doing this. And then you can see this pattern formation. So first it produces the waves, and then it tessellates the space. It tessellates the space in a Voronoi pattern, Voronoi, Voronoi patterns, very famous. And so these will become the fruiting bodies of the dictyostelium. So the dictyostelium is more complex than just the chemistry of the oscillatory reaction. It does a little bit of the oscillatory reaction, and then it kind of coalesces into this more complex pattern. Now, the whole life cycle of the dictyostelium is what we would like to explain, right? We would like to be able to model the entire thing. We have been able to model here the left part of these phenomena. Now, we haven't yet been able to model the culmination and the fruiting body, but this is closing the cycle. Hopefully, we will have a model that is able to give us the entire spectrum that covers the entire life cycle of the dictyostelium. I don't know if you've seen this before. It's just a bit mind-boggling. These are not single cell. This is not a multicellular organism. It's single cellular organisms that are clumping up and forming this fruiting body that will propagate the spores. It looks like a multicellular organism, but it is an arrangement of a number of unicellular organisms that operate according to hopefully simple rules to produce complex behavior. Computer models, right? They can do it. That's what I mentioned before. And then we can study it. I mean, it's not only about them, and they can do it in different scenarios. Hearts, you have propagating waves here. This is work by some colleagues in the University of Washington, I believe. So, yeah, these are propagating this model, a Fitz-Hugh-Nagumo model of an oscillation in the contraction and relaxation of the individual muscle cells in the heart. And these are basically happy hearts where you have these wave propagations. I think that these are rabbit hearts. I'm not sure. And then you can study similarities and the differences between the simulation and the experiment, and then play. Because if you have a simulation, the beauty is, if you have a simulation, you have a model. And if you have a model, you have parameters. Here you have the reaction diffusion equation on the right side that is parameterized by a certain set of parameters, for example, some injected current, and you have here the injected catalyst. Then you have parameters A and B. And as a function of those parameters A and B, you may or may not see the dynamics of the pattern formation. You can then study what's the dependence of the parameters on the probability that you will see a pattern against the theory, knowing that then, yes, biology is full of variation. At least there is a rule, a law that biology is trying to follow. And you can then use the fraction of cyclic AMP receptors, for example, to via the external cyclic AMP concentration to study which are the regions within which this setting will form. And then you can tamper with genes, for example, and you can create a knockout of a cell that will modify some of these parameters and then potentially disrupt the pattern formation, transforming the organism from the one that did spirals to the one that did not do the spirals. And maybe the one that did not do the spirals has some fundamental difference. I think this is a study, or basically this is a picture from the previous study in which they did a genetic model to try to pinpoint the fundamental molecular contributions on the pattern formation of the PTSD. Tiny little amounts sometimes, right? So you change your gene per medicine, or you change the concentration smoothly, but at one point, the pattern starts appearing. Now, it's already 45 minutes. You've encountered cellular automata before. This is just to give you a few more views of the ways in which simple rules express themselves in reality. So you can see the shell, actually, that's a picture of mine. That's a shell I found in the Brazilian beach. And on the right side is one of the one-dimensional cellular automata by Wolfram that has class 4, which is an aperiodic class. Now, they're not identical, but they are strongly reminiscent. In fact, I think that you can probably create something like the last one. You just have to figure out what the rules are. And the rules can produce a grand variety of patterns. And if you do this in 2 dimensions, I mean, you have seen Game of Life before, and I'm going to just leave you with one metaphor. There's music in this one, so I hope the volume is not too loud. You should be asking yourselves, what do you think you'll see at the next level? We're zooming out of the 2-dimensional Conway Game of Life. So is life computation? Is reality deterministic? Is life expressing patterns, like from the smallest to the largest scales? Are the rules present in different levels? So this is a glider. And the glider is a little computational entity. It propagates, seems like it's propagating in this very simplified model of life. Now, this is maybe, just a digital analogy, but it's to get our brains thinking about how is it that very simple rules, just about, carry on expressing their own properties at higher and higher levels, even to the point of you creating the emergence of the functions of brains, such as computation. So brains compute, but they compute with ultimately the matter of the universe. We are the mud that stood up. So that matter of the universe that is inside our heads somehow creates emergent computation. I can calculate, so you can calculate. Calculation is computation. Computation emerges from matter, but matter is computational, or is it? One more example of a cute one. So I like this one because it's more continuous. It's the modern version of the game of life in which there are some other roles, but you can also play with these ideas. This is what I wanted to give back to you as we wrap the session. I want you to think jovially about modeling with dynamical systems. I want you to explore ideas and be creative, to think about how could it possibly be? I mean, if people say it's not exactly like reality, it's okay. Sometimes it's okay. You're just exploring, you're thinking, you're trying different things. Who knows, might actually see discovery. I think that this is a continuous version of the game of life with partial differential equations. If you're curious, can give you some reference. And clearly, this is the entire spectrum. This is the last element here. Would we be able to, via playing with models and trying to discover which are the fundamental aspects of complexity, go from the egg to the embryo? Right. So this is the question. To tell you that this is also central for your study, dynamical systems view of stem cell biology a few years back in Science has done this analogy very explicitly. And so that's why I grabbed the figures. In A, you see a energy landscape. Stem cell can take one of many paths, type 1, type 2, type 3. And that fate is a function of the stem cells here in red and the function of the expression of protein A, B, and C, for instance. 3 wells in which they can fall, differentiation wells, so to speak. This can be explained by the interaction of a smaller number of genes. So I feel this is a very compelling way to think about differentiation and pattern formation too, and that's why I wanted to share it. So this lecture today was actually about patterns, right? More than dynamical systems in general, to give you broadest sense of why these projects that we're giving to you are relevant. I mean, if you will look at this from many perspectives, you will be helped by some of the greatest YouTubers out there. 3 Blue, 1 Brown and Veritasium are great sources for this type of material that you're going to be learning here. This summarizes what I said before. One thing that I want to emphasize for the last time is that the rules that we're trying to discover in models are immanent in matter, starting at the elemental particles, but in their interaction that is rule-based, even if it is quantum, even if it is, if you cannot measure it and predict, nevertheless, quantum particles interact in a number of specified ways, and they have internal constraints, and those constraints are then getting expressed at the next levels. The laws of reality imply time, imply dynamics, imply entropy, imply temperature. Interactions, for most particles, are local. And so, it's neighbors talking to each other, producing some gradients or creating like a certain environment. So for pattern formation, there is a path dependency. So where it's going to land, it's a bit how it started, but there's still similarity because the laws are similar. Phase transitions create the analogies at the pattern level. And it's not only form, it's form and functions. Think about what there's relationships are. And you see a pattern in reality.